What is up to all my computer enthusiasts out there? Welcome back to yet another Gregory's Brain episode. I have yet to do one within the last 2 years or so. Last time I've done one of these was actually during the Turing launch. But today we're going to be dissecting Ampere as objectively as we can with the information that we have. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to essentially try to dumb things down a little bit. I don't want to make this too complicated for the average PC gamer, PC user. But just to give you guys an idea of Ampere's recent launch that we saw roughly 3-4 days ago. And yes, I'm not doing this in the kitchen like Jensen did. I am doing this in my living room. So, before getting into things, I would like to address that I will not be discussing the improved ray tracing performance on the next gen RTX Ampere cards, nor the DLSS improvements based on the tensor cores. This is basically the raw rasterization performance presented during the presentation. Though they didn't give us much to work off of, but there's been quite a bit of confusion in the PC communities across the board as far as CUDA cores go. So before we get into that, here's a word from our sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by the Weeping Willow, also known as the Salix babylonica. The Salix babylonica is a species of willow native to dry areas of northern China, but cultivated for millennia elsewhere inside of Asia. Being traded along the Silk Road of Southwest Asia and Europe, it has somehow found its way into my backyard. Thank you, Weeping Willow. Huge thanks to our sponsor for helping us, helping myself, put this video out there for you guys to hopefully learn from. Every video I've made, whether it be my personal videos or our Talking Tech streams. If you guys aren't familiar with them, our Talking Tech channel will be linked down below. It's essentially a live stream where myself and fellow enthusiasts within the industry just discuss objectively and at times theorize, various architectures. It doesn't matter what the subject matter may be. We intend to follow through with visiting various topics from, gaming to PC monitors, of course CPUs, GPUs, that's our specialty, that's what we really enjoy. But getting down to it, I just really want to address firstly the rumor mills. They really do a disservice to a lot of these companies. They could make or break an architecture based on misinformation per their leaks from the sources, which are never substantiated, of course, because they're clearly breaching NDA if they are correct. And in this particular launch, there's been many rumor mills touting sources and specs, and at the end of the day, none of it added up. But the biggest question has still yet to be answered, and that is Ampere's ability to just simply use traditional rasterization as opposed to leveraging their tensor cores in the form of DLSS, deep learning supersampling, to improve performance up across the board. But as far as raw rasterization, there's been quite a bit of confusion about the CUDA cores themselves. And that's what this video is about. And in order for me to explain this properly, I need to go far as back as Pascal, though I'll probably reference Fermi. Right? For those of you who are around for Fermi, or even farther back, you guys will understand why, because that's really when the CUDA core was truly a CUDA Core. The CUDA Core, by the way, is no longer a CUDA Core, and I'll get into that at some point in this discussion. But first off, I'd like to address Pascal. So right now what you're seeing is a Pascal SM, a single SM, a streaming multiprocessor within Pascal's architecture across, GP 102, 104, 106, what have you. This is a simple SM, and essentially this is the path that Nvidia is really focused on, and they've stuck to this particular design for many generations, as far back as Fermi, using dual dispatch units, as well as just basic ALUs. You have to understand that cores on GPUs are actually pretty dumb cores. They're designed to do one or another thing, either integer computation, being 32-bit integer computation, which is simple math, and floating point computation, which is more so, decimal points, and it's a little more complex mathematics. I don't want to get into the deep details as far as floating point precision, but the fact that floating point precision essentially runs 90+% of all of rasterization in games is a big deal. Now, we could always take these numbers at face value and just say, AMD has pushed out a tremendous amount of floating point single precision compute and prior generation cards, yet didn't match Nvidia's cards. And that's where Pascal comes into play, because Pascal was an extremely efficient architecture, though it relied on a rather dated design that Nvidia stuck with for many generations prior, which leads us now into Turing. Now, Turing was somewhat of a game changer, and a lot of people didn't really understand why it performed the way it did, and I understand, the disappointment, not just in the pricing, but the lack thereof in terms of raw rasterization and the push for, ray tracing, which is, they have their dedicated ray tracing cores. I get it. But it's truly, it doesn't come down to that. It's ray tracing, the way it's being utilized, at least through RTX, is via Microsoft's, not Nvidia's, Microsoft's DirectX 12 API library. More specifically, their DXR API. And this is something that both Nvidia and AMD have worked closely with Microsoft to develop. So yes, AMD, I can't wait to see what RDNA 2 has to offer as in terms of ray tracing performance and how they choose to utilize dedicated hardware ray tracing and utilizing DXR. But we have yet to see anything or hear anything from AMD. So I implore you guys, just stop with the rumor mill and speculation, because there's really nothing coming from AMD outside of Microsoft's Xbox reveal, the Series X, which gave us a slight look into the new RDNA 2 architecture, but myself and Lukasz and Shannon all agreed on Talking Tech that this is a very custom designed architecture, being a SoC, a system on chip, for the Xbox, that we really couldn't make out any definitive theoretical examples of how RDNA may come to be, especially in terms of Big Navi. I know there's a lot of hype behind it, but guys, just wait. Same with Ampere. I mean, this is not a definitive answer to what or how it's going to perform. I don't have benchmarks for you. Guys, simply wait for the benchmarks and the white papers. I'm personally waiting for the white paper so I can really, truly break it down. But in terms of revisiting the past, here I'm going to show you guys the difference between Pascal and Turing. And that was a huge generational leap in terms of efficiency within the SM. It has changed between Pascal and now into Turing, which was pretty much foreseen, at least by myself, when I made my hypothetical, or theoretical rather, diagram of the TU102 SM, which was pretty much spot on, sans a few minor details and cache pools. But I'll show you right now the difference in between the two architectures and the switch from the superscalar model that they've used for many, many years, stemming from Fermi and all the way through Pascal, and switching over from a single dispatch unit, or a dual dispatch units, to a singular dispatch unit rather, as well as the warp scheduler itself seems to be redefined. It's far more efficient, as well as the dispatch unit working in tandem with warp scheduler. Essentially they're taking all these instructions. You have to remember, these rely off single instruction, multiple data, which we refer to as SIMD, as opposed to SIMT, which is more so for the prosumer space, and pretty locked down with Nvidia's Volta architecture and many others like it. It's really an exclusive to Nvidia for SIMT and their use of CUDA cores. But when you look at the difference in these particular SM layouts, it truly shows you how efficient Turing came out to be. And a lot of people were disappointed, and rightfully so. The prices were extremely high. A lot of people forget to take into account that despite this being Turing being built on a TSMC's 12 nanometer node, it wasn't a true die shrink by any means. The TSMC 12 nanometer FinFET was actually designated 12 nanometer FinFET N by TSMC themselves. The FinFET, of course, being their node. It's a very popular design as far as pitch gating and all that lithography stuff, which I'm not going to get into. That stuff we get into on Talking Tech. Once again, feel free to tune in next weekend, as we'll further explore various aspects of the industry. But that node in particular was a custom node made specifically for Nvidia, and it retained the 16 nanometer FinFET from Pascal as far as density goes, but it had considerably more efficiency, which of course, as far as manufacturing is concerned on TSMC's end, those dies experience considerably lower yields. So that's why you would see that those price hikes. These dies were massive, but the biggest change in rasterization actually occurred during Turing, which a lot of people don't acknowledge. So if we're looking at Turing versus Pascal, one thing to note, which is very important, we even look at, say, a TU104. TU104 being used in the 1080 I'm sorry, 2080 as well as a 2070 had considerably fewer CUDA cores than the Pascal generation's 1080 Ti. And I'm going to pull it up on the screen right here. 3,840 compared to 3,072. Now that's a pretty large deficit in terms of so-called CUDA cores. And the way they did it is simply by splitting the floating point compute units, their ALUs, apart from their integer 32 units. So the warp scheduler rather, at this point, the way they were able to do it was by simply splitting the floating point 32 units from the integer 32 units into separate ALUs. At this point, they're no longer CUDA cores, in my opinion, because the CUDA core, as we've known it in the past, was a combination of both, as we saw in Pascal, Maxwell, Kepler, Fermi, all architectures prior. It's changed dramatically since Turing, and the efficiency in rasterization is there, and it's proven itself. In just raw rasterization, when you see a 2080 competing with a 1080 Ti, which has considerably more CUDA cores, that simple change, it's not as simple as it sounds, but you know, on a high level, it is a rather simple change to split the floating point units from the integer units. Now we have to remember that the CUDA core has changed dramatically over the years, particularly pertaining to Turing, but it really started with Volta. The CUDA core, as we know it, is not truly a CUDA core, based off of Nvidia's design. The CUDA core was essentially just a basic ALU. It contained a floating point and integer unit within a single ALU, and based on, you know, Pascal and prior generations using their warp schedule, which was still capable of the same 32 threads per clock, being dispatched through dual dispatch units, dispatching 16 threads per clock. You have to understand that it's truly changed since Turing, and a perfect example would be the SM diagram, where they split the floating point units from the integer units, allowing far more parallelism as far as floating point compute, which leads us to Ampere. Now, we all saw in the presentation by Jensen and several other people, but primarily by Jensen, that the new Ampere architecture will be able to simultaneously run twice as many floating point computations per SM comparatively to Turing, which Turing in and of itself was a very, very optimized architecture. It was very efficient at doing what it did. It didn't get the credit it deserved, but rightfully so, because the pricing was absolutely astronomical. I know myself, I bought several Kingpin cards at $1,900 US MSRP, which to the average consumer obviously is unattainable, but when you even look at the 2080s and the 2070s from Turing, they were very, very expensive despite the dies. Obviously the 2070 used the T104, but you have to remember that, you know, there was a lot of R&D that went into this change in architecture, and it primarily focused on efficiency as well as incorporating their new DLSS technology on, you know, utilizing their tensor cores, which of course I'm not going to get into all that because they do have a new revision of their tensor cores, as we saw in A100, and they touted in their presentation itself for the consumer GA 102s, which are the only ones at the moment slated for release. Of course, expect far more Ampere SKUs to go down the line, and I just want to address something very quick. Yes, there's always the potential for a 3080 Ti or even a 3070 Ti, just based off of the simple fact that the CUDA cores, as we know them, the deficit between these dies, there's the same die just cut down from the 3090, they're cut down to the 3080, and then cut down even more so to the 3070. So if you're going to expect any, mass production as far as volume goes, the 3070 will likely be far more readily available than the 3080 or 3090 at launch. The 3090 is just it's going to be a massive chip. Nowhere near Turing's. Keep in mind, this is also built on Samsung's 8 nanometer FinFET. It is not EUV, but it is a custom node once again, similar to what they did with Turing's, with TSMC's 12 nanometer FinFET. But when we start diving deeper into the numbers, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a slide here just to give you guys an idea. As we start diving into the numbers comparatively to prior generations, we've already discussed Pascal and Turing, but now we're going to be looking at Turing against Ampere. You see this massive jump in CUDA core counts, as Nvidia calls them, but in my opinion, they're not CUDA cores anymore. They are separated from, they're no longer ALUs. Now as we jump into comparing Turing to Ampere, we see this deficit in terms of CUDA cores. And of course, we saw in the presentation from Jensen for the Ampere release that the RTX 3070 will outperform the prior generation Turing GP102 GPUs, which powered both the Titan RTX as well as the 2080 Ti's. I own several 2080 Ti Kingpins, and quite frankly, I believe it. And I don't want to get into the other details as far as memory bandwidth is concerned, because a lot of people have this misconception that just raw throughput has everything to do with memory, and the larger the memory pool in terms of GPU VRAM is the defining factor in high resolution cases. That's simply not the case, because you got to take latency into account. The quicker you could store the textures and anything into that VRAM pool and get them out of there and replace them is also a defining factor. It's not as simple as just raw throughput, but that's also another topic of discussion I'm going to get to in regards to Ampere. But first, I'd like to address their CUDA core counts, which they've listed as below. For the RTX 3090, which is much like the 3080 and the 3070, based off the GA102 GPU. So once again, excuse me, it's there's always a possibility for there being TI models, just based on the deficit in CUDA core counts. I find it unlikely that they're going to do so, but if they do, they can, quite simply. But when you start looking at these numbers, they don't make sense to a lot of people. And I understand why. When Nvidia initially released Turing, the CUDA Core counts were considerably lower comparatively to Pascal, and now they're considerably higher comparatively to Turing. And the reason for that would be, of course, Jensen's mentioning of double the floating point precision, just standard floating point 32-bit precision throughput per SM, which of course had myself and several other people debating on social media as to how they were able to achieve this. It's actually, I went into this with 3 theories roughly, but I'm going to side with one. Obviously the white papers have not been released, so take it with a grain of salt. I'm not a rumor mill. This is not, this wasn't fed to me by some inside source breaking his NDA, which clearly didn't work out for quite a few outlets because they were way off. But when you start taking these numbers into account, essentially what Nvidia did, and I'm going to show a theoretical. So this particular SM diagram was initially put out there with credit given to Nvidia as a source of the diagram, but it's since been taken down as far as I could tell. I'm looking right here at their website, at the article, but I will throw the SM diagram up there as well on top of another one which makes more sense. Essentially, now we don't have 2 separate pipelines for floating point integer, with a warp scheduler being able to assign certain instructions, whether it be pure floating point. Keep in mind that each SM cluster is only capable of 32 threads per clock, so regardless, it's going to assign any type of instructions to either floating point or integer. If it's pure floating point, it will just keep instructing floating point. If there's a few integer instructions in flight, which I'll get to in a moment, and in flight doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but what Nvidia did with Ampere essentially was doubled up their one section in their SM, or SM clusters rather, to allow for simultaneous integer plus floating point 32 instructions, as well as keeping a separate line of floating point, dedicated floating point units. So the numbers released to you as far as CUDA cores, yes, these things have a massive amount of cores in them. But the numbers presented from the presentation are peak throughput. Don't expect, these raw numbers to be any example pertaining to performance in gaming and rasterization, but they will play a large role if the warp scheduler is able to send out instructions to a dispatch unit, primarily floating point computation, and a few integer threads in flight. They're able to do so in tandem simultaneously, which will increase rasterization from any given level immensely. It's just a matter of fact. And what they pulled off here at that level is beyond remarkable. I really have no words for that. And despite all these other rumor mills explaining, I'm gonna stop saying the word rumor mills. As far as Ampere in relation to Turing being the TU-102, which is the top die, comparatively to the GA102 being Ampere's top die, which they're using across, of course, multiple SKUs, being the 3090 being the top dog, which I believe to be a replacement for the Titan altogether. It makes sense. The Titan naming scheme should have died after Kepler. That was truly the last, not the last Titan, but it was the first and only Titan up until the Titan V that performed its purpose. It was a multi-purpose card for consumers and prosumers. We haven't seen that since, in between the Titan V and the initial Kepler Titan. But comparing these CUDA Core counts, we have 10,496 CUDA Cores. They call them CUDA Cores still. To me, they're simply ALUs, but they're split. In the case of Ampere, it seems that they're going the route. I theorize this with some of my friends, Lukash, and well, primarily Lukash, but also with Shane and Rob, as to how they're going to pull this off. And we discussed the concept of potentially them, Nvidia, increasing their warp scheduler to accommodate 64 threads per clock, and adding considerably more cores, which would, at the end of it, it just didn't pan out because that would take up way too much die space. And this being built on a very custom Samsung 8 nanometer node, which is, no matter how custom it is, we don't know any specifics about the node itself. We would have to wait for the white papers to come out before we could even discuss the actual lithography behind it, or the node itself. But the CUDA Core as we know it is not the same as it used to be. And that started with Volta and of course continued on through Turing, and now it's changed even more so, albeit it is kind of an original CUDA Core on one side of any SM fragment in Ampere, depending on how you want to look at it. I'm still waiting for the official white papers, but the core counts add up, and the fact that Ampere is able to simultaneously, in parallel, compute, upwards of 16 and 16, you're talking 32 floating point single precision units, refer to them as shaders if you'd like, in parallel, in flight, is just simply phenomenal, just in just raw rasterization. So any type of rumors that you may have heard or anything like that, throw it out the window. Nvidia got this one right. I'm not going to sit here and defend Turing. I love Turing, and I understand why they did it. It was a massive push on their end. I don't doubt it cost them a shit ton of money just to develop the architecture. And it's been a long time coming, but the actual core counts, CUDA core counts, ALUs, whatever you want to call them, they're not true core counts. They are essentially a split between double the floating point 32 units per SM cluster per SM per TPC per GPC with the same exact int 32 integer 32 compute units within any given SM cluster, SM, TPC, GPC. But yeah, I really look forward to seeing these cards out in the wild. I can't wait for the white papers to drop and the reviews to drop. But guys, yeah, as far as sheer rasterization goes, this card should theoretically perform as Nvidia has advertised, as opposed to the Turing launch where they didn't release any form of rasterization performance. And even with the Ampere launch, they really didn't, with their graphs, they didn't really identify their charts and their graphs as far as whether they were just performing traditional rasterization or if they were applying DLSS or ray tracing when they were comparing, Turing to Ampere. But as far as I can see, this is going to be a monster, regardless if it's a 3070, which I have no doubt. As far as the architecture itself. All right, guys, well, I'm gonna leave you guys with this one last diagram, which is a theoretical diagram that was, of course, put out there long before I could draw it, and I'll also throw up my Turing diagram that I drew out long before the white papers were released, and comparing the two architectures and the changes made. Hopefully I was able to explain it well enough to you as far as the concurrent floating point units being able to compute any instructions in terms of floating point, or not any instructions, but floating point instructions concurrently within any individual XM. So the raw throughput is something to take into account. Yes, if you're going to concentrate on raw floating point single precision, the numbers that Nvidia put out there is peak performance. The throughput is peak. It doesn't mean anything in terms of rasterization, but having that parallelism within each given SM fragment, being able to compute, not just floating point 32 precision in tandem, which they've always been able to do, but also integer precision without interfering with floating point precision. So essentially what we have is 16 integer cores plus 16 floating point cores on top of a separate section of 16 extra floating point cores. It'll be up to the dispatch unit and of course a warp scheduler to really throw these instructions out there, and through the pipeline, which is heavily based on driver support, which of course we really don't know much as far as the front end pipeline, whether it was significantly changed, though I'm sure it has been. How it's going to truly play a role, or whether it even will, I don't see why it wouldn't. There had to have been some significant changes, but yeah, ultimately it's going to come down to drivers and the maturity of them. But Ampere, in my opinion, is a clear winner. So, having said that, I hope you guys have a good one. This is a video that I was kind of apprehensive to make to begin with, simply based off of the non-stop talk about Ampere and the speculation and misinformation and the questioning of whether these are, the numbers add up. The numbers add up. They do. So now we just wait for the official NDAs to drop. I will not be reviewing, the initial batch of cards. I don't do that. I'm not a product reviewer. So hopefully when those products drop and the reviews drop, this point will make that much more sense. Understanding the underlying architecture is very important. It's not just about benchmarks, guys. And it just shows the true evolution of GPUs. And not just on Nvidia's end, but also on AMD's end. They've changed dramatically over the last few years. And RDNA was a huge step up from GCN. And I truly look forward to RDNA 2, and I can't wait to see what AMD has to offer. So having said that, I hope you guys have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. This should be posted Sunday on Labor Day weekend. It's going to be pouring rain here tomorrow. So wherever you guys are, whether it's in the US or anywhere else in the world, I wish you guys a wonderful weekend, and I can't wait to revisit this topic on Talking Tech after the official NDAs have dropped, and we could actually get into it in greater detail based off of white papers and analysis by myself, Shannon Robb, and my good friend Lucas Liz. Well, both of them are my good friends, but until then, guys, take care.